Okay, now let's come to some other stuff. Here we have early reflection and the reverb mix. So let's take out the reverb for now. Now we only have the early reflections. So early reflections are technically just the first bounces from the sound off the walls in this simulated room. Okay. Now let's keep it like this and see what diffusion and size does. So diffusion may not be acting so much on the early reflections, but more on the reverb itself. But let's just see what happens. Yeah, see, it doesn't do much on the early reflections, but size does. Let's just see what happens. So you see the size just puts all those early reflections closer together. And when they're getting really close, you can notice some fun phasing effects kicking in. And this is really interesting because, again, depending on what you want to do, you can really enhance certain characters using those phasing effects. Now let's go the other way around, turn down the early reflections, get up the reverb. Let's see what happens now with diffusion. Now this is interesting. Notice what happens when diffusion is at 0, you hear the sound much more direct, as if it was closer to you. But the higher you put the diffusion, the more, you could say, washed up the sound gets. It gets less direct. Now let's listen what size does. So when the size is lower, then you hear the whole sound kind of gets a bit more narrow, a bit more dense, and a tad more direct, you could say. And now you can play around with those parameters again, however you want. Oui. Now let's get the early reflections in again. Now that's interesting, isn't it? You can put those cool phasing effects into some interesting use. And now, what's pre-delay? Well, the word itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's the time you set before the reverb actually kicks in after the direct sound has hit. And you will notice it best when we put the wet-dry mix a bit down. Now decay linear or not, this is pretty much, just how the tail of the reverb is shaped. Is it linear or is it curved or, So contrary to what you may think now, decay and time are not the same. See, when I put on the decay, It's much shorter than without it. But if I put down the time, it sounds rather different. No? So yeah, that's so much for how reverbs work. Of course, I can also show you some other reverbs now I have here. For example, the IRL, also by Waves. Now I can show you a good comparison here. Let's put, for example, a plate here. And now you will see that plate does not equal plate. Because let's load the plate from here. You see? Very different. So that's why you can't expect that whatever you do with your reverb might sound the same what I do with my reverbs. It's very, very different. Now, this is the room verb from Studio One itself. As you can see, it has a couple of other parameters, but essentially they still do the same thing. And here, instead of individual sliders for early reflections and reverb, this one just has one mix knob with which you can set those. So, yeah. The interesting thing on this reverb is you can totally shape the room however you want it. And it does act on the early reflections, and this in turn acts on the whole sound of the reverb. And also this one just has one dampness knob. And here it also has a population knob. Now this is weird, calling it population. Basically, what I find it does, it's kind of like a dampening knob for the low end. There. And reflexivity. Pretty obvious. Reflexivity just puts in more of a reflective character instead of a washed up reverb character. And you can even set the geometry where you stand in the room and where the reflections are. So yeah, pretty interesting.